Listen, listen. The sound of the bell takes me back to my true home. Listen, listen. The sound of the bell takes me back to my true home. Listen, listen. The sound of the bell takes me back to my true home. Good morning, dear friends. This is Saturday, February the 2nd in the year 2008, and we're at the Tibet Butler Nature Reserve in Orange County, Orlando, Florida. The title of the Dharma talk that I am going to offer to you today is called "This Moment Heals All Moments." And I want to begin with a great scientist, Albert Einstein. He made the cryptic remark a long time ago that of all the religions in the world, the only one that could address the social ills that society and modern civilization was facing would be Buddhism. Now, let's not take that at face value. Let's investigate it to see if there's any validity to Einstein's view. Because we certainly are in a mess at the moment with the global ecological emergency and the international war against terrorism. But we should realize that this is another crisis throughout history. And if we examine history, we'll see that there have been many such crises that could have eliminated the human population. In the early stages of hominid evolution, there was a very good chance that our forebears in the very, very distant past would be eliminated. The Black Plague had a really good shot at wiping us out. The Spanish flu, the danger of pandemic in our present time, these are all crises throughout history. And although history has different contours of time and space, there's a similar human response required at each moment of crisis. What's required is that there are mature, steady people who have done the internal work so that they have internal resources of spiritual strength to draw upon. And they have somehow developed the skills to be right there in the present moment. When we look at history, we're brought to a very, very important notion in Buddhism. This is the notion of impermanence, that things change. Breath rises, breath falls, civilizations rise, civilizations fall, presidents rise, presidents fall. The notion of impermanence is built into the understandings that the Buddha had about reality. The point of being present is very simple. It's so that the ghosts of the past and the ghosts of the future do not provide hurricanes for our mind to be swept up in. We all have suffering from the past, as individuals, as nations, and as cultures. Suffering is there. That's a fact of life. If we are caught by that suffering, that hurricane of hate, of vengeance, of discontent, will color everything that we think and do. When we're caught in the hurricanes of the future, the fears for our future, the anxiety about the potential elimination of our species due to global warming, that anxiety is causing illness and death. That anxiety alone. When we are caught in these hurricanes of the past and the hurricanes of the future, it's as though ghosts are riding our mind, and we're not clear. The point of learning how to be present is so that we're steady, right here in the present moment, and from that point we can examine the ghosts of the past and the ghosts of the future from a point of steadiness and clarity. So the point of being present is really very important. And the point of not being caught by external forms, not being caught by the past, not being caught by the future. This leads to another important notion in Buddhism. This is the notion of signlessness. Now, what signlessness means is simple. You are not caught in the sign. You're not caught in the form. You're not caught in the old mental formations. And so much of the crises and conflicts taking place around the globe at this present time is that people are caught in the old mental forms. Tribalism in its many ugly faces, whether this is in Kenya, Iraq, or Washington, D.C. Tribalism has the same character. There are many things that we are caught by. Signlessness is an indicator, a very important concept in Buddhism about not being caught. So I'm going to place these two notions together, impermanence and signlessness. They're at the basis of understanding the whole thrust that the Buddha provided through trainings, practices, and instruments so that we could be present. When we are truly present, something extraordinary happens. We can heal, we can bridge, we can transform. And perhaps by making impermanence and signlessness the foundation of today's talk, I'm presenting an aspiration for you. The answer is to aspire to being fully present in this moment, now. When we can do that, we're in a position to transform not only ourselves, but everything around us, just through being totally present. Now I'm going to surprise you with something here. As a civilization, we're collectively trapped in the notion of global warming. This is a mistake. Global warming is not the problem. It's a symptom of a mindset. It's the mindset that is the problem. The mindset that is driven by consumerist madness, manipulated by very clever cabals of corporate culture, who have their very powerful offshoots within the political structure. The ascendancy of finance capital has so transformed the world with its control, and the strings of finance capital are pulled by the US. And we have to examine this. What can we do to change a structure that is so powerful and so entrenched? We can be present. We can be present as consumers. And I will come into this in more detail later on. But the bottom line is that basically consumers hold the power. I've always wanted to get these teenage hackers who can get into the Department of Defense data banks and in Canada and in the US. I'd love to get a bunch of these brilliant young people who have a sense of mischief and put them together and say, please unite all consumer organizations around the world to have a selective boycott of certain corporate products in return for consideration that you may purchase those products. That also appeals to the sense of mischief that I have. But I also think that this sense of mischief could be put to very good use. And I know some brilliant teenage hackers who are on the edge of the drug culture, but I'd pull them in from that and I'd just put them to work. But consumers, mindful consumption, which is something I'm going to address later, can you be present with your mindful consumption? But before I get that, I'm going to take you through some easy stages. So global warming, somehow external to ourselves. We think of global warming as it's over there. It's not really rooted in our mindset. It's not really rooted in our patterns of consumption. Whereas I hope to show that your patterns of consumption, my patterns of consumption, if they're not rooted in being present with our consumption, will destroy the earth and make it unavailable for our grandchildren. We must find ways to change the mindset that is the problem. And we start by learning how to be truly present in this moment. And we're not starting from zero in this endeavor. The Buddha provided many instruments, practices, and teachings to enable us to be present. One that springs immediately to mind is the touching the earth ceremony that we will do this afternoon, where we become present with the garbage from our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors, our genetic ancestors, and our land ancestors. We are going to candidly examine the garbage we've inherited and let it go. And then we'll also examine the virtues of our ancestors and choose to retain that in our consciousness. It's a very profound exercise. But we will be present with our ancestors, not angry at them, not furious with them, but just be present, candidly observe those features we've inherited from different sets of ancestors which are present in our consciousness. We can say bye-bye. We choose not to retain it. We have that power to choose, especially when we are present with the process. But I will talk to you more about that this afternoon. My starting point in terms of the Buddha's teachings is the Diamond Sutra. Or to give it its full name, the diamond that cuts through illusion. The illusion is that we're separate, that we're individual, that we're not connected to the earth, to other species, or to anything else. The diamond is the clear mind that has trained itself to see through that illusion and to touch the reality of interbeing, of interconnectedness. And this particular sutra is so pertinent to the present global ecological emergency. Because if we want to look at reality from a point of interbeing, humanity, nature and the environment are totally interconnected, completely intertwined. You cannot actually think about one without the other. So if we want to look after human beings, we have to look after Mother Earth. And if we want to look after Mother Earth, we have to look after ourselves. The taking care of is through meditation, through mindfulness practice, through the actualization of interbeing, making the notion of interconnectedness a cornerstone of our everyday life, and also being aware of the consequences of our actions. These four things: meditation, mindfulness practice, interbeing, and aware of the consequences of our actions, we can put this recipe into action by first of all arriving at the state of it being fully present. And there is a source of wisdom, in addition to that of the Buddha, that ties into the Diamond Sutra very closely. This is the wisdom of the elders, of Native Americans, who even now are trying to return us to a sacred ecology. Although sacred ecology is not a term the elders would use, because they assumed that the natural course of things was that humanity would have a deep spiritual relationship with the earth and with the cosmos. This was assumed. And there was a deep humility and reverence for all of life that underlay the wisdom of the elders. They saw that the threads of order that tied humans, the planet, and the cosmos together were part of one single brilliant tapestry. Whatever the tradition you tap into, whether it's the Hopi in Arizona or the Dene in Canada, they have the same cosmology. And they always looked forward 7 generations into the future. And they grounded their activities, their social structure, on this vision of looking forward, taking care of relationships between humans, the cosmos, and the planet, 7 generations. We can't even assure our grandchildren that this earth is going to be here in a habitable form at the present time. So I think a shift in cosmology is in order. What we've done is to turn reverential into referential. And we have to move the equation back the other way. I remember at the Rio conference in 1992, there was a teenager from Canada who gave the only speech at that conference that was worth listening to. She nailed all the UN representatives from different countries who were there in their pomp and intellectual splendor. She nailed them. She just said, look, you can't assure my generation. She was a 14-year-old. You cannot assure my generation that things are going to be okay. Then she paused, and she really glared at the entire gathering, and she yelled at them. And she said, if you can't fix it, don't break it. You know. And she was magnificent. This was the daughter of David Suzuki, the renowned Canadian environmentalist. And she and her young teenage friends had raised the money to get themselves down there. And they were given this token spot. And they lit a stick of dynamite and threw it. But she basically yelled at the UN representatives to do better. This was 1992. That teenage voice wasn't heard. the voice of our Aboriginal forebears, the wisdom of the elders, that voice has not been heard. And we also have wise elders in our scientific community who in the mid-90s issued a warning to humanity about what was happening. These were not scientists tied into the tobacco industry and lying through their teeth. These were the scientists who are tied into corporate culture, who lie about global warming. These were senior scientists, Nobel Prize winners, the true elders of the scientific community. And in the mid-90s, their voice was very similar to the voice of the wisdom of the elders. They too have been ignored. We ignore these voices at our peril. Our teenagers, our elders from science, our elders from the Native American tradition. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have a view stretching 7 generations so that we can assure our children and our grandchildren, yes, there's something to look forward to. But how do we get from here to there? How do we get to a position where we can assure our descendants that there's a place on this earth for them? The Buddha carefully and patiently provided a methodology, a direction. When we think of the manner in which the Buddha awakened to full insight, to full enlightenment, we see that once he was awakened, he didn't jump out from the Bodhi tree and rush out, "I've got the good news, brothers and sisters." He sat there, very patiently, placing his insights into the nature of reality, into the appropriate vessels, so that he could communicate with utter clarity to different audiences. And this is what he's provided in terms of retraining the mind. Remember, the problem with global warming is not global warming per se. That is a symptom of a mindset. How do we retrain that mind? It's simple, really. We learn to be present, totally present. And in the mindfulness trainings, the Buddha provided a series of guidelines of how to get out of suffering and to change the mindset that makes the decisions. In a previous visit to Florida, I spoke at length about the 4th mindfulness training, about mindful speech and deep listening. And I drew on my adventure with one of my sons in the drug underworld of Glasgow. Now, I'm not going to go into that again because that's already been captured on DVD, which is available from Fish Lake Sangha. But the point I want to make about deep listening as the key to the 4th mindfulness training is that without being present, we cannot listen deeply to somebody else. We just run our agendas. We run our assumptions. And there are levels of deep listening. We can have an intellectual appreciation. Oh, deep listening is a good idea. But we have to get beyond the intellectual. We have to realize that our capacity to listen deeply to somebody, our partner, our child, our business associate, we have to be present. We also have to build our capacity to listen deeply by resting that capacity on other practices of mindfulness, such as mindful eating, mindful meditation, touching the earth ceremonies, all of these kinds of things. These are the garden out of which the flower of deep listening grows. But most people get stuck. They get to that point. My deep listening has developed out of my practice. I'm doing well. But there's another level of deep listening beyond that. And it took a crisis in my life and in the life of one of my sons, who was caught in the drug culture of Glasgow, for me to recognize this. Because the only thing I had to offer my son and his friends was my mindfulness practice, and most of all, my ability to be fully present. And that took me to a totally different understanding of deep listening. Because when you listen deeply from being fully present, the I of your ego dissolves. This is not a concept, this is a direct experience. And I've done my best to communicate this to therapists and psychiatrists, that if they could learn to be present, their capacity to listen deeply to their clients would make medications less necessary, because that capacity to listen deeply heals and transforms. It takes you into no time, no space. And that's what the gift is from being present. I said I wasn't going to talk about this, as I've spoken before, but I've rambled on a little bit. What I want to do is to present something much more difficult to you. I think you get the idea that if you want to tame the mouth, you have to tame the mind that runs the mouth. That's kind of obvious. And you can only tame the mind by cultivating the practices that enable you to be more and more present. Now let's take this to an area that will be difficult for you. I didn't promise you a gentle party. I want you to wrestle with this difficulty. Can you be present with your patterns of consumption? And this is addressed in the 5th mindfulness training, one of the most important ones that the Buddha has in his toolkit for the present day. Now, to be present with our consumption, we have to be candid. We have to look at our consumption and recognize a number of things, a number of ugly things. And then make a decision if we want that ugliness out of our lives, or whether we wish to continue with such ugliness. Most of our consumption fosters violence. The violence in video games, movies, television. This is a mainspring for violence to be expressed by our young children, and it translates into murder in high schools and colleges. So that every high school and college is now a fortress against such incursions of violence, because the root cause has not been addressed, the availability of violence to young minds. And it's not a teenage problem, it's not a college problem, it's a societal problem. Because both you, I, and young people are brought up in a culture of systemic violence. We also consume through all of our senses, our desires and our cravings, and everything that we consume, all the toxins we take in, the homophobia and hate, in many modern lyrics. We take it in. We take in the demeaning of women through advertising. You can't sell a car unless you have a half-naked woman draped over it. This demeans women. The fashion industry makes it alluring that if you're not super thin, you're not attractive. And this plays hell with the minds of our young girls growing into womanhood. And on it goes. Through every sense, we are bombarded with toxins. What those toxins do is they feed consciousness. The consciousness is just sitting there, eating everything, taking in everything, whether we are aware of it or not. We're bombarded, the consciousness eats it, that consciousness then drives us. So if we fill our consciousness with violence, this will drive our thoughts. This will drive our actions until we use our mind differently. We use our mind in such a way that, okay, I'm aware of this. I'm being present and candid with my consumption of violence. I'm now going to use practice, meditation, mindfulness practice, actualization of interbeing, aware of the consequences of my action. The same recipe. We make a decision. So we use the mind to turn the mind. But before we can do that, we have to be aware. We almost have to be sickened and hit over the head several times before we really get it, that the toxins bombarding each sense feeds the consciousness. And the toxic consciousness then drives us. We have to short circuit the system. Again, we come back to being present. Let me come back to what we eat. And I want to bring home to you aspects that you're probably readily aware of. If we look at industrial animal agriculture, which is not farming as we like to think about farming, the old-fashioned sense of little Annie on the prairie, that's gone. Corporate culture, factory farms, under inhumane conditions for animals. In the corporate factory farm system, animals are treated with incredible cruelty. Their horns, beaks, testicles are removed without anesthetic. They're in cramped conditions. And when they end up on our plate, we are eating their anger and their suffering. And it goes into every cell of our consciousness and of our body. Now, this then translates into consciousness. We've consumed our violent ways of producing animal products. And the direct relationship to our consciousness is a no-brainer. Also, it's very clear, and we've got this in Canada, that industrial animal culture pollutes waterways, places bacteria in the water systems, and kills humans. We had the Waterton crisis in Ontario. And this is repeated the world over. But there's something much more devastating than the cruelty aspect of industrial animal culture. In November 2006, the FAO, which is a very conservative part of the United Nations organizations, they produced a report called Livestock's Long Shadow. This was astonishing. Because there are the obvious aspects, such as land degradation, that the 70% of the tropical rainforest has been removed in order to provide ranches for livestock. 70% of the world's proteins, fiber, and carbohydrates do not go to human consumption, they go to livestock. Half of the water consumed in the US goes to livestock. And there are endemic water shortages in the western states. And many of the conflicts taking place in the third world are over water scarcity. But it's the impact on climate change which will astonish you. The contribution of livestock to climate change is the second largest contributor in the world, far in excess of all the emissions from cars and trucks. There's a combination of the release of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and ammonia. And it's a deadly mix. 18% of greenhouse gases come from livestock. So this presents a very difficult conundrum for meat eaters. I would like to say something like, meat eaters of the world, unite, you can save the planet. Not by giving up meat, but by reducing your consumption by 50%. And this is what the FAO report concludes as a minimum. And this is the power of the consumer. And in the retreats that Thich Nhat Hanh gave across America last year, and in the retreats and talks that I give on Buddhism and the environment, I'm very moved by the response of the students who come to listen either to Thich Nhat Hanh or to me. People are moved. By reducing your meat consumption by 50%, this is far more than giving up your car. The attention to different kinds and sources of emissions that the FAO report directs us to is alarming. And vegetarianism has long been presented as a lifestyle choice that you can take it or leave it. It's supposed to be healthier for you. But now it's a different choice. Moving towards a more vegetarian lifestyle can in fact save the planet by reducing greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere. So it's not a preachy message about lifestyle and being healthy. It's how do we save this planet for our children? And most people I talk to who are meat eaters are prepared to reduce their consumption, and I am so impressed and so grateful. My descendants, not yet born, will be grateful. And I encourage them to not buy meat that has been processed, to look for free-range meat, free-range eggs, and to consciously bring their dinner times at least 15 days a month. Not a big deal. 2 days a week, meat-free. And that's much bigger than me giving up my car, which I'm going to talk about later. That is much, much bigger. And you're all intelligent. But if you wish to be present with your consumption, and the facts from the FAO report, they're not in dispute. And it's slowly filtering through to the mainstream. in this week's New York Times, I saw a number of letters to the editors about livestock's long shadow. So obviously somebody had published a long article about it. But it's not front page news, not yet. Those of you who are journalists and writers can perhaps help to make it front page news in your particular area. So livestock's long shadow is real. This is not something that's been dreamed up by a bunch of loony leftists. This is the FAO, the most conservative component of the United Nations organizations. And this article, or maybe major position paper, is on their website, and it's called Livestock's Long Shadow. And I'd recommend that you check it out. But I also recommend, if you are truly going to be present with your consumption, there's something you may wish to change. Personally and in your household. And there's a very specific teaching about this that the Buddha gave. It's called the Sun's Flesh Sutra. And it's a story about a young couple who were running away from a political situation that was dangerous from them, and they were going from one country to another, and they had to cross a desert. And they had enough supplies, or so they thought, for this crossing, and they had their small son with them. Halfway across the desert, their supplies run out. And the husband and wife made a dreadful decision. They killed their son. And they dried the meat of their son on their shoulders as they walked through the desert. And every time they would taste and eat some of the meat of their child, they would cry. The Buddha was pretty graphic. And he said to his monks, "Do you think the young couple were happy to get across the desert?" And the monks said, "No, Lord, they must have suffered so much." And the Buddha replied, to really drive it home, this is what we do with our unmindful consumption. We eat the flesh of our children. I would add to that, in that what our consumption patterns around meat and alcohol are also doing, we are eating our Mother Earth. So just being present with your consumption and listening to me carefully, I hope this will lead to changes, considered changes in your life about what you consume. And as I say, a 50% reduction in meat eating is far more than giving up your Hummer. Those of you who have a Hummer or an SUV. I had some of my students who are quite rabid environmentalists. At the university, there were several professors who would drive up in a Hummer, and they wanted to spray paint the Hummers. And I said, well, write something nice. I knew I could not dissuade them from what they were doing, because they were furious, because they had talked to both of these professors about emissions and all the rest of it. And so they were going to do it, and I said, write something nice. And they had a sense of sarcasm that I kind of liked. They wrote on one panel, this is the way to save the world. Exclamation mark. So they did do their best. So with the Sun's Flesh Sutra, we're brought home to the recognition that if we are not present with our consumption, we deny future generations the right to live. We also have to carefully examine the way in which toxins bombard every sensory doorway. We have to find the way to guard our sensory doorways. And really examine our deepest desires and cravings. If our deepest desires are vengeance and absolute power over others, then we're going to create terrorists. If rampant consumption is our deepest desire, we will create a degraded planet. And the main cultural activities in Canada and the US are watching TV and shopping. So consumerism is rampant. And I see this at our major celebrations, such as Christmas, Easter, Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day. The captains of industry target these events as major retail opportunities. And mindless consumerism is pumped up to the max. Christmas, which we have just celebrated last month, it's far removed from the spiritual foundations of Christianity and the birth of a Savior. The excessive emphasis on consumer products created by fossil fuel feeds consumers, feeds global warming. There's a link, there's a chain, and we have to really recognize how we are so manipulated by the captains of industry, who have huge corporate giants in their own right, their public relations firms, to make us desire things, stuff that we don't need, and to buy. Our political leaders, we have a crisis, go out and buy. Keep the economy going. It's the economy, stupid. But that's not correct. It's the ecology, my friends. Because I'm not going to call anybody stupid. It's the ecology. And if we want to put things right with the ecology, we learn to be present. And the tools are there, because mindfulness is our protector. Our cravings and desires can take over our lives with disastrous consequences. That's why we use the mind in a different way. That's why the Buddha created the mindfulness trainings. The 5 mindfulness trainings are just a wonderful vehicle. And tomorrow we're going to have a transmission ceremony of the 5 mindfulness trainings for friends who are here from Gainesville. And it is a beautiful ceremony. And the energy is transmitted through me, from my teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, through his teacher, his teacher, his teacher, all the way back to the Buddha. It's a direct line of transmission. And the mindfulness trainings encourage us to be present with our speech, with our consumption, with our sexuality. Every domain of our life, we're encouraged to be present, so that we can transform ourselves and everything around us. And mindfulness is our protector. When we look at something like the mindfulness trainings, I've been talking to you in depth about the 5th mindfulness training, about consumption. I've alluded to the 4th mindfulness training, which is about speech and listening. When we go deeply into any one of these trainings, study it, discuss it, listen to a teacher talking about it, we touch something. Because the mindfulness trainings came from the awakened mind of the Buddha. Thich Nhat Hanh rephrased them in 1996 so that they're more pertinent to the modern day. So we have his awakened mind. When we touch deeply the mindfulness trainings, we touch the awakened mind of the Buddha, of Thich Nhat Hanh, and of every awakened mind in this long chain from the Buddha to the present. But we do something more. We touch the capacity of our own mind to be awakened. We all have the capacity to be Buddhas. We're all Buddhas to be. But some of us have got some work to do. And that's all grist for the mill. But the mindfulness trainings, and this has been the focus of this Dharma talk, if we want to be present, use the mindfulness trainings as a guide. Because the trainings are exactly what they say they are. They are retraining the mind in the direction of the most compassion that we can manage in the moment. And those of you who would like to come to this transmission ceremony tomorrow morning, you can talk to Bob or to Pam for directions. It's a very, very beautiful ceremony, very deep and heartfelt. So it's mindfulness that's our protector, because our mind can be enslaved and caught, but our mind is also the instrument for liberation. We use our mind to make choices. You have a choice to be present with your speech, truly present. And there's a Zen saying, open mouth, already big mistake. We can examine that and see, okay, what are we doing with our speech when we're not truly present? And when we're truly present with our consumption, we can change the world. We can first of all save it. That is really a very, very big item for each of us to wrestle with. Now there's one last thing I want to offer you from the Buddha. This is about throwing away. Because before we can be present, there's certain stuff in our mind that we have to throw away. And in an absolutely brilliant sutra called the Sutra on Mindful Breathing, the Buddha very carefully shows how 16 different methods of using one's breath can take us into liberation. Our feelings and emotions, our perceptions, and our objects of mind. These are the objects of investigation. And this afternoon we will be addressing these 4 objects of investigation when we do the deep relaxation ceremony. I'll explain this to you at that time. And each of the trainings dovetails each of the 16 exercises, which is retraining the mind so that we can throw away our anger, our frustration, our fear, and our anxiety. And we come up to number 14 on the list. The 13th one is really very important, is breathing skillfully, breathing in and out. I contemplate impermanence. That's number 13. And the emphasis is on skillfully. Skillfully, I'm using my insight, my concentration, and my mindfulness. I'm not an idiot. I'm not an airhead. I'm being skillful. And this sutra is so misunderstood because people take it at a superficial level. It's not for airheads. It's for people who are determined to change their mindset. So you come to number 14. Skillfully breathing in and out, I contemplate letting go. There are two ways to translate the letting go part. One from the Sanskrit and Pali versions, it translates in English as letting go. From the Chinese and Vietnamese texts, it translates as throwing away strongly. Quite a difference. Letting go is for wimps and wusses. Throwing away strongly is when you have the internal strength to throw away. I want to tell you a story about throwing away, where I started off as a total wuss, a total wimp. I threw away really reluctantly, until such time as I could see the fruits of that practice of letting go becoming stronger, and it was throwing away strongly eventually. But I started off as a total wimp. This is when I relinquished my car several years ago. I did this with much reluctance. I knew it was the right thing to do environmentally, but I let it go just at the beginning of a winter a number of years ago. And every time a wintergreen Subaru would drive past, I would weep. Especially if I was clambering over a snowbank trying to catch a bus. And I'd frequently get on the wrong bus, and I'd visit parts of the city of Ottawa that I had no intention of visiting. So it was a relearning process. And I also should be honest with you, giving up my car wasn't as virtuous as it sounds. My insurers would refuse to insure me because I had many little small cat crashes, which were very expensive for them. And the last one is when I ran into my neighbor's minivan and totaled it. My beloved Subaru Outback just had a little dent in the fender, but his minivan must have been made out of plastic or something. It was totaled and he couldn't drive it away. So he was a nice man. He was also, thankfully, because he was also a very big man. And we drove to the nearest police station to report the mutual accident, which was actually my fault. I maintained to Carolyn for a while that I thought Jack was driving on the wrong side of the road, but I think it was me. So at the police station, we gave the particulars of the accident, and the police sergeant said, well, I'll put this down as a no-fault collision. I was about to point out to him that no-fault collision is an oxymoron, and my neighbor quickly hurried me out of there before I opened my mouth. You know, open mouth, already big mistake. And then he asked me to drive him to a mall because he was meeting his daughter. Very trusting, given the circumstances. So I mused that just perhaps my not driving would make it safer for every other driver on the road, as well as the obvious environmental advantages. But I found that the city of Ottawa was so well served by bus services and light rail, and I would have missed out on one of the most hilarious conversations of my life if I hadn't been traveling by bus. I was coming back from my university on the 117 home and going to Baseline Station. And there was a young man on the bus with a 12-pack of beer under his arm, and he was 3 sheets to the wind. And he was staring at me so intently. And I was, not making eye contact because I really didn't want to strike up a conversation with him. Then after a while he said, "Hey, ain't you the ecology guy on TV?" And I demurred that indeed I was. And he said, "Hey, me and the boys, we watch your show every Monday. We have a 12-pack of beer and we watch your show. It's great, man." And he carried on chatting to me about recycling, that when he went drinking in the woods, he took his bottles out with him. And just before he got off, he had a stop before mine. He offered me a bottle of beer, which I accepted graciously. I didn't drink it, I just put it in the bus driver's bin, and I think the bus driver had it later. But I was very moved by this young man that I didn't want to talk to initially. He was an inspiration to me. And if I'd had a car, I wouldn't have had that opportunity. And between Baseline Station and home, there was a kilometre walk along Pinecrest Creek, which in winter was stunningly beautiful. I would see red foxes, coyotes, owls. I started to carry bread for the ducks and a camera, because some of the sunsets over the ice-rimmed field leading to the creek were just awesome. And I couldn't believe it. How could this be in the middle of a city? But it was. I just didn't know it was there. And I relocated all essential services within walking and biking distance. So when people wish to see me, they have to come and find me within biking range, my biking range. They can drive a car if they like. So it was a total change in lifestyle, and I started to see all the benefits of giving up my car. Now I can put it down to throwing away strongly, but at first it was letting go like a wimp. I really complained, didn't I, Carolyn? So there's a big difference between letting go. Letting go is kind of, I'm really still attached. And we have to look at the nature of attachment and perhaps call it by its true name. We all have attachments, and we find it difficult to get past attachments, so we should perhaps call our attachments by its true name, its addiction. That's why it's very hard to let go of attachments. I was addicted to my Subaru Wintergreen Outback. We had a long life together, which is now terminated. But I do see the fruits of that practice, and I love telling this story. Now, everything I've talked to you about in terms of learning how to be present, it's about organic gardening in the mind. We are choosing to water those seeds in our consciousness that are wholesome, that are compassionate, that are caring, and that foster our internal strength. We're choosing not to foster those seeds in our consciousness, which leads to acute mindlessness. We're gardening, organic gardening in the mind. And just before just after I retired from the university, a friend inquired of me, just what was I occupying my mind with now that I was no longer teaching at the university, as though I had somehow gone into a desert. This is my reply to her, and I will read it out. I have enjoyed the time and space to play with Mother Earth as a diligent and slightly crazed organic gardener. The blaze of flowers at the front of the house is a testimony that I'm doing okay so far. An experienced gardener would no doubt wonder what on earth I am doing in the backyard of the house. The back garden is surrounded by trees, so it is as though one is in the middle of a forest. I plant vegetables in between flowers. Veggies have such a dull life, struggling to poke their heads above ground, then taking in rain, sun, and soil nutrients to end up on some human's plate. So to make the veggies happy, I plant them between gorgeous flowers, so they have some jazz and elegance around them while they are alive. Just imagine a carrot waking up in the early morning and seeing a beautiful pink hibiscus in full bloom on the left side and multicolored snapdragons on the other side. They're bound to be happy and grow really well before they end up on some human's plate. And on it continues with beets, tomatoes, lettuce, arugula, Swiss chard, kale, rhubarb, beans, asparagus, cucumbers, peppers, peas, and so on, all planted between beautiful clumps of flowers. There's also a herb garden in amongst the peony bushes. Some herbs are very nice and well behaved, but others are just downright rude and unsociable. I had to separate a green basil plant from a red basil plant, as they were always quarreling. Now they are at opposite ends of the garden in their own solitary tubs. They are thriving. An experiment I tried was to move a small juniper tree from the front garden, as it was dying there, to the back garden where there is a tall cedar hedge. I think it will be much happier in the backyard. Cedar language is a bit different to juniper language, but a lot like French and Spanish, so they can communicate a bit. I have welcomed the juniper into the backyard with much compost and water, but I will leave it up to the cedars to encourage her to live. And she has decided to do so, and thrives in her new environment. And on it goes with much weeding, and then much more weeding, to keep both the veggies and the flowers happy. Often I'm not aware of the difference between a weed, a veggie, or a flower. So I just leave whatever it is to grow before I take any action. My garden is a still place, yet buzzing with life and joy. This is also a metaphor for the organic gardening I do in my mind every day. That blooms also, with the diligent daily watering of the beautiful positive seeds, and the careful pruning and transformation of the negative and harmful weeds. Simple, yet surprising. I thought you really needed to know that, just to make you smile. One thing I didn't put in this letter to my friend was a story about my neighbor, because he would look at my garden and he'd shake his head in disbelief. We were using the same organic stuff, and my garden was magnificent, and his was kind of brown. So he said, "Ian, what are you doing?" I couldn't talk about watering seeds in my mind and things like that, so I said, "Well, Greg, what I do is, after dark, when nobody's watching, I go out and I pee on my garden." And he said, "Really?" I said, "Yes, but it's long after dark." I haven't yet checked up on him to see whether he whether he did the same. But my garden was not just a joy for me. It was a joy for all my neighbors and people who would walk past and strike up conversations with me that otherwise wouldn't have happened. So being present, totally present with my garden, was wonderful. Not just in terms of what grew, but also the natural interconnectedness with passers-by who would want to talk about this flower or that flower and so on. Now, to bring home the significance of all that I'm talking to you about in terms of being present. I'd like to tell you about a sweat lodge ceremony I did with Native American elders, very respected elders. These were from the Ojibwe, Dene, and Mohawk nations. And they tend to regard me as their white elder. And we have been doing a lot of work over the past few years in terms of focusing energy to restore Mother Earth. In the prayers that were said, the individual and the collective prayers, I was so humbled by the commitment to the earth, the dedication of these wonderful human beings. And we were totally present with each prayer, totally present with each person. And there was no boundary. The I of the ego in each one of us had dissolved, just as it had with my son and his friends in the adventure in the drug underworld of Glasgow. When you are truly, fully present, the I of ego dissolves. Transformation happens. At the end of the fourth round, we emerged to find there had been a snowfall. This is the last winter snowfall, about a 2-inch snowfall. And it was still coming down softly, and there was a crescent moon in a star-studded sky. And we were all very quiet. And we walked up to where we were camping in our bare feet. And we were leaving footprints in the snow, and we were just quiet, and we were all smiling. And I looked back and I saw these footprints. And I gestured to my friends to stop and turn. No words were appropriate. And it was as though these were the first footprints on Mother Earth. And it was an epiphany for all of us. Each one of us knew that business as usual was no longer possible. And after listening to me today, dear friends, business as usual is no longer possible for you either. Because really, if we can be fully present with each moment, we have a constant epiphany open to us. We reconnect to the natural world, and to be in a nature preserve such as the Tibet Butler Preserve today is such a gift. And my preparation for this day has been such a gift. At Fish Lake, where Bob and Pam are my gracious hosts, I wake up in the morning and say hello to an osprey, or a blue heron, or an ant, a lizard. And I'm present with all this. I have the opportunity, the time and the space to be present. And it's all a huge epiphany. I encourage you all to be members of Fish Lake Sangha so you can go and share in this epiphany that I'm describing. But if you can be present with each moment, that moment is an epiphany. When the I of the ego starts to dissolve, you are tasting the fruits of your mindfulness practice. But if you don't practice, you won't taste the fruits. There's work to do, internal work. And you're doing it, otherwise you wouldn't be here today. And if we can treat each moment as our last moment? How would you choose to fill that moment? I hope it would be that you would choose to be totally present in each and every moment. I began this talk with a great scientist, Albert Einstein. I would like to finish with another great scientist. This is Howard Odum, who is a systems ecologist, who writes in a mythic sense. This scientist is writing about the earth taking in an in-breath and the earth taking an out-breath, and it's quite wonderful. For the in-breath, with the turning of the earth, the sun comes up on fields, forests and fjords of the biosphere, and everywhere within the light there is a great in-breath, as tons upon tons of oxygen are released from the living photochemical surfaces of green plants, which are being charged with food storage by the onrush of solar photons. Out-breath. Then when the sun passes in shadows before the night, there is a great exhalation as the oxygen is burned and carbon dioxide pours out, the net result of the maintenance activity of the Earth's living machinery. If the Earth can breathe in and out like that, we can be present with the Earth breathing in and out like that. When we breathe in and breathe out, we are breathing for the Earth. If we are just present with our breathing, in and out, we are breathing for the Earth. We're sending a message to the core of the Earth as a sentient being that yes, we recognize you. Yes, we are with you. Our world requires, as never before, that we do the work, that we mature spiritually, so that we can be steady and present. We want to move from here to there. There is being able to have a future for our descendants 7 generations from now. We must be present. We must be spiritually mature. That takes work. It takes diligence. It takes practice. It takes community and Sangha. When we do the work, we listen to the ocean of consciousness. We touch something beyond our individual bag of bones, our sense of self. And it is awesome. It's as though you're living on a constant high, but you're not taking drugs. So listen to the ocean. Be fully present in order to do so. I would like us to join together with Carolyn as she chants, "Listen to the ocean." And when you catch on, please join in.
Silence is the ocean. Language is a river. 100 voices inside say that's enough for now. That's enough for now. When the ocean calls to you, don't walk to the river. Listen to the ocean. That's enough for now. Silence is the ocean. Language is a river. 100 voices inside say, that's enough for now. When the ocean calls to you, don't go to the river. Listen to the ocean. That's enough.